What is it? The housing element is a local plan for responding to existing housing needs and future growth in jurisdictions throughout the state. It is required to be updated every 8 years, certified by the state Department of Housing and Community Development. We like to think of this as a community discussion, a gut check on where we are in terms of the housing crisis in our cities, and the collective development of a response plan so that we're doing better going forward. Next slide. This time around, the housing element is different. There's new scale and there's new process. It's a very high bar. There are very clear guidelines that have been distributed from the state. In most cases, they're very clear. And there's a whole new element of affirmatively furthering fair housing, which we're not going to focus on today, but it is going to come up. Jurisdictions have to plan for way more housing and way more affordable housing. The numbers that are expected are just higher this time. There are much higher standards for community engagement. It needs to be targeted and focused on lower income folks and protected classes who may have specific housing needs. The process requires broader and more detailed assessment of housing needs than in the past, and a really detailed discussion of barriers and constraints in the document. Policies and programs need to be developed to respond to housing needs, and these policy and programs require clear process and timeline. In the past, we've had some great ideas without a clear course of action of how we're actually going to implement them. This time it's different. So there are more teeth. There's more leverage for local action. The state housing community development is withholding certification through this process, and housing elements, it can be decertified over time if they're not meeting the plans and goals that have been set. So this is an opportunity for us to move local priorities and really set the foundation for substantive policy change going forward. Hopefully this is going to make our work easier going forward because we've had some of the tough discussions up front and the plans are in place. So with that, let me introduce Sohab Mehmood. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to let her go ahead and jump in. If we could go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. This is a timeline slide. We are behind schedule. And what we're really going to be talking about today is this little circle at the bottom, in which there's the draft and review and ongoing public engagement. And this assumes that there's been significant outreach already, that we've done our assessments of housing needs and fair housing constraints, the assessment of constraints on development and evaluation of past housing element policy. And we're really moving into this final stage, which may or may not be the middle of this process, where there's a back and forth with the states and the cities and the community. If we could now go to the next slide.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Sohab Mehmood. I'm a senior policy specialist with HCD. I am also a senior reviewer on housing elements. A lot of our housing elements, after assigned to an initial reviewer, will go through another senior team. And so I want to say about 25% do go through me as well as part of a second review. So you'll either be seeing me as part of some of your calls or just being even possibly the primary reviewer. But I want to take the time today to go over the public participation requirements, both the statutory requirements, as well as maybe just some best practices, as well as where the state tends to, how the state looks at public participation and how that plays into the housing element. So the first things that we really look at in a housing element, initial draft all the way up till the end, is this statutory requirement here that says the housing element must demonstrate diligent efforts to achieve public participation of all economic segments of the community in the development and the adoption of the housing element. Essentially, what this is saying is two things. One, you must have engaged in or completed different types of outreach to different types of community or economic segments of the community. So your outreach cannot just be limited to a workshop. It needs to be limited beyond just workshops, whether it be webinars, whether it be flyers, whether it be stakeholder meetings, pop-up events, et cetera. It needs to be very diverse in how you do your outreach. And then second, it needs to be reaching very all segments of the community, but that also means not just the people who have time or just frequently comment on housing elements, but the populations or communities that aren't always reached during our general government public participation process. Lower income families, extremely low income households, people with special needs, people with persons with disabilities, stakeholders that represent these different types of population categories, service providers, developers, nonprofits, homeowners, renters, people living in, if especially when you're looking at fair housing, if you have communities that are considered high segregation and poverty, and they're considered racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. These are key state indicators of certain communities that have disparate access to opportunities. There needs to be hopefully special focus and outreach on those communities as well. With that being said, another piece that we look at as required by statute as well, it's a very hard line, is that the initial draft, very first draft before coming to HCD, must be released to the public 30 days prior to HCD submittal. In addition, if you get comments in that 30-day process, that if you've received public comments in the 30-day process, the city must take at least 10 days to consider those comments before, again, submitting to HCD. So it could be a 40-day process before you getting to the initial HCD submittal. If this has not taken place, it is an automatic kickback of the housing element. If the 30 days for the initial draft they have not followed this process, 30 days for public release, 10 days to consider comments, if any have received, the housing element, once it comes into the door, it gets checked right there for that process. If it hasn't been determined that, or the city has not followed that process, the housing element gets kicked back to the city. We will not start the review until that is completed in itself. Next slide, please. So I went through that initial draft, or even before it hits our office, what will statutorily have to take place. This one particularly is another part of a new law that for revised drafts. So there was some mention about there will be some back and forth with HCD on the draft, even in the adopted. We've had back and forth with SCAG jurisdictions, Southern California jurisdictions, who are in the process right now, anywhere from 4 to 5 reviews for each city. So a lot of back and forth in that. All revised draft elements. So you get your findings back from HCD, you revise that element, must be posted for 7 days, and a link must be sent to all previously interested parties. A best practice in here is just, aside from this piece of legislation, just to be transparent, to engage the community, to make sure you're providing a real opportunity for the community to look at revisions, comment on revisions, provide feedback. You always just want to make the revisions available to the public, period. And 7 days, you could do even longer. Some jurisdictions do longer than just 7 days. But you make it available to the public and you send that link to all commenters, stakeholders, invitee list, e-blast list. Don't just limit it to interested parties. And additionally, you should advertise that the revision is out, not just sending a link, but, making sure it's on the website, making sure that, to the extent that you can, or the different venues that you have, making sure people know that you've made revisions to the draft. Please take a look. We're looking for more comments. Next slide, please. And then there's another statutory requirement. This states through Affirmatively Furthering for Housing, AFFH, it states that the housing element must describe, so it must implement, meaningful, frequent, and ongoing public participation. So the key word here is ongoing. The housing element process, both the update process and the implementation for the next 8 years, should be an ongoing public community participation process. It shouldn't be just something you do on the initial draft or before the initial gets to HCD and that's that. It should be an ongoing process, and these are statutory requirements prescribed by law. And with that, I'll just stop here at this slide to just really talk about, one thing that we've heard a lot of is, what happens when The initial draft comes through to HCD. Sure, maybe they've done their 30-day review, but the public participation was just super weak to begin with. So there was a couple stops I will just mention, or a couple checks in this long process that they may undertake to get their housing element compliant. Of course, the first one is that we want to, as a state, as reviewers, to manage that as early as possible. If the draft was not fully available, or if it, they didn't engage to the extent that they should have, stakeholders and the community for the housing element, the first thing is that if you, as an advocate or a commenter, know that that's happening, it would not hurt to submit comments before that draft even comes in-house to us. That is, it's happened, it's typical. You can totally submit comments before that draft comes to us. All of the Bay Area has an assigned reviewer for each county. And so you could always just contact your assigned reviewer and formally send an email letting them know that the public participation process has been weak, so that when that draft comes in-house, we know front hand that that process has been slim, and that we can address it early in the process, not towards the end of it. And then, of course, we do our 30-day check to make sure that the initial draft is available for 30 days. If not, it's getting kicked back. Also, in that initial draft review, we're checking to make sure that they've demonstrated that public outreach was diligent, it was to all economic segments of the public, and it was beyond one or two workshops, or a flyer, or a study session, and that was it with elected officials. And if we find that it wasn't really beyond those couple workshops, or one or two, or just focused on elected officials, that draft gets a finding about public participation. At that point, a jurisdiction, it's important, and a jurisdiction could or should do this, that once they get that findings letter for that initial review, and they find, we find them that their public participation as of what it looks like is inadequate, they should go ahead and engage in additional public participation efforts to address that finding, and to also continue to engage the community. That revised draft that comes back to us, we still are going to check for that finding again. Did you go back, or did you, in whatever the capacity and the extent you can, engage the community, or demonstrate that you've engaged the community, all economic segments, and you've made true diligent efforts to engage the community. Additionally, as they go through this process, there's going to be, depending on the jurisdiction, a number of reviews, a number of finding letters. Right now, the average finding letter for Southern California jurisdiction is 3 to 4 finding letters, which means 60-day review processes, a year time. In this whole process, there is plenty of opportunity, I believe, for advocates and the community and anyone involved in the housing element process to comment as part of the housing element findings letters that we issue. Oftentimes, I'll see is, especially when it comes to fair housing and when it comes to the general programs, jurisdictions are always coming back to us of like, so what are programs, what are actions and strategies we can do to address these findings that meet the standard? And we always say, one or two things. Go back to your community, see what they're looking for in this realm, for this particular topic. And second, look at your public comment letters. Hopefully in the public comment letters, by that point, there are policy recommendations. And it's a great way to help a jurisdiction address policy findings or program findings in the housing element. So, we get, almost all jurisdictions will get or have gotten in Southern California AFFH findings, especially towards the programs or about the programs. And the question is, so what type of place-based strategies should we be implementing? What type of housing mobility strategies should we do? And if they're public comment letters giving a list of actions or ideas on like, do this, think about this, what about that? And there's a huge community push on some of those actions and strategies, it's a great way for that local government and that housing element to get to re-engage with their community, and then also address our findings, and to put out programs and actions that truly reflect the community's interests and needs. At that point, and let's say we're in 3 to 4 reviews with the jurisdiction. Hopefully they've, rehashed and recalibrated their public engagement process, and they've addressed it early on, and they're continuing to work with they should hopefully be continuing to work with their commenters to get feedback from them on their revisions. And we're coming towards the end point. Hopefully, fingers crossed, we're going to be close to calling them in compliance. Maybe they're getting close to adoption. And let's say there are still concerns about public engagement, whether, it's still kind of slim, or the community is still hoping or expecting for there to be additional engagement. There's a couple avenues there. The one thing is, we have in the past called it as part of in compliance findings letter that, public engagement, if it was slim, it should continue to happen throughout the housing element period as you implement various housing element programs. You should be engaging the community on what those housing element programs should exactly be scoped out to, or how exactly they should be implemented. Typically, there's a pretty good sense in the housing element by then that there's a implementation plan with that housing element program, but continuing to engage your community and the stakeholders to implement that housing plan or housing program will be very important. And that's a finding we can make as part of an in compliance letter, or a FYI we could put in the letter that we have done in one other jurisdiction if we find that there could be and should continue to be engagement. Obviously, you see on this slide as well, as part of AFFH requirements, you want to have ongoing engagement with key stakeholders and really just the community as a whole throughout the housing element process. The last place and the one that is, as a kind of like a hard line, is the APRs, annual progress reports for the housing elements. At that point, a jurisdiction is going to be submitting their annual progress reports on their housing element. How are they doing on the various commitments they made every single year to HCD? Most of the time, I think if not, the APR has to be adopted by City Council, at least what I found. But don't quote me on that. I would have to double check. But as part of that, it should be, and it's a great opportunity to again continue to engage the community every year on the housing element. What programs have worked? What haven't? What is the city doing? What does the community think where we can expand a program, or we can strengthen it? Or if a community has seen when the housing element programs be implemented and it worked or it didn't work, that's a great opportunity for the community to provide feedback and input on the program and give a really good sense of how the housing element implementation process is working. With that, I am going to stop here. I also have a 12:30 hard stop. I apologize for that. But hopefully that gave you a general sense of not only the process that happens with HCD, there's opportunity at any time while that review is in process, even when we're not reviewing the housing element, to provide public comments on all kinds of parts of the housing element. And to also, I always recommend I completely forgot this slide, but I kind of went over it. It's really important that where possible, you can provide policy and program recommendations to that jurisdiction, because I've always found that those have been really helpful as part of facilitating HCD's review and just making a housing element that's really reflective of what the community wants and needs and would like to see. And I think with that, I will pass it on back.
Great. So we just have a couple of minutes. So let me jump in. Let me just say, y'all, that Sohab has jumped out of her day to join us today, and we're incredibly appreciative. But I think she has a room full of folks waiting for her to return. So let me just get a couple of questions that we had. One that just came in was, is there a public noticing requirement for when you all send your comment or deficiency response letter back to the city? How do we know when you've responded to them?
No, so there's no public noticing requirement, but we do a couple things. So one is we post that public comment letter on our website. You can always go back to our website to see if it got posted. Second, you can reach out to the assigned reviewer and just ask, or you could always just ask like, hey, when when you post it on your website, could you please let me know if you have a chance? Or hopefully they can give you a general sense of the date. Hey, we'll likely issue a findings letter by the end of the review period, like on the day of the end, which typically what happens. And so you can find the comment letter at that time. They may send out a copy or not to you, but you can always request it. So know the assigned reviewer. Always contact me if you don't know one. I can find out who your assigned reviewer is. Email them, ask them for a copy, or ask them for what date they're expecting to issue a letter. And then around that time, look on our website, and we post a copy of all of our findings letter, I should say, on our website.
Great. So for folks here, we will be working with others in the region to track that. And at the end, we will share a link to our Housing Elements Toolkit, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But we will try and track that and make that available to folks, because that's clearly really important, and it seems like a piece that we miss. Your last minute. So you talked a little bit about how you wanted to know ahead of time about whether or not the noticing isn't working. Is there kind of a threshold? In many cities, some folks are being engaged, some folks aren't, and it's hard to know exactly, who was noticed and how. And is that something that's done on a case-by-case basis? Is it helpful to have more of that comment as opposed to just a single comment to that effect? Or what's the best way of engaging locally in that part of the problem?
Yeah, I would say, if you're engaging locally with the local government on, as you're commenting to the local government directly that, hey, I think you need to expand the public participation process. That would be even a first step, is to talk to them about how can they expand the public participation process, where you might see gaps, and provide them recommendations on how to expand it. And then the second piece on letting us know is really, I would say, if a housing element, if they're planning hypothetically on submitting it in like month of February, hypothetically, letting us know around December, January, or anywhere where you feel like it's appropriate to now engage us. We may not fully engage when the housing element hasn't even been submitted, but at least we know well in advance, once we get that housing element, that we need to look for it to see if it's in there. And if it's not, we can call it out to the jurisdiction much more sooner in this whole process than later on in the process.
Great. One last really quick question.
Sure.
The assumption has been anything that gets shared with the city, it's useful to share with you all, so you know what that back and forth has been. Is it valuable for you to get copied on this communication that folks are having with the cities?
It would be totally up to you to decide if you feel like we should know about or be involved, or not so much say be involved, but if we should be notified about something that might be going on between a conversation or a comments that you're having between the city. So it happens. It happens often where a comment is going to the city, but we're CC'd on. We do consider all of that official public comments for our review, and so it is getting considered as part of our review.
Great. Marvelous. Thank you for the extra 2 minutes. We appreciate your flexibility. Thank you for joining us, and we look forward to engaging with your team going forward. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, guys. Have a good one.